I'm going to introduce you real quick to our guest here. This is Josephine Riesman, Josie, and she is a freelance reporter and a great writer. She's written this wonderful book on Vince McMahon, but before that, she wrote a book on the rise and fall of Stan Lee called True Believers. I've not read that yet, but it's in my Amazon cart even as we speak.
Aww.
And I hear a rumor maybe of a sequel to this book, and your bio says that you're working on a Beck biography.
I'm writing a biography of the musician Beck. Yes, that's my current project that I'm under contract for.
Marvelous. I can't wait to see that. Well, I'm excited about this book. The book is called Ringmaster, Vince McMahon and the Unmaking of America. For those of you who haven't gotten a copy, I cannot tell you how enthusiastic I am about this book. The office around here is quite tired of me talking about it, but probably going to be talking about it a lot more. Why don't we go ahead and get started, Josie, if you don't mind?
No, please.
I'm fascinated with a couple of quotes from the book and then from this article you wrote for Polygon. You said in the book, what's more, you said in the book, wrestling shaped a whole generation of millennial men. What's more, I learned what society wanted boys to be.
Mm-hmm.
We are, in our own ways, Vince's children. And then just this March, you said, wrestling showed me how to be a man, but it also gave me a second message, one that I had finally reached me. Wrestling taught me to be cis at 13, and it taught me to be trans at 36. What was your what drew you to this story? How did you decide?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I love that you're jumping in with the gender stuff. Why not?
Mm-hmm.
I'm always, most interviews I do, the interviewers are too timid to ask about the gender stuff until it's the last question. It's like, and before we go, I just no, so thank you. Yeah, wrestling was very important to me when I was a teenager, back when I thought of myself as a boy, and it was instrumental in me figuring out kind of how millennial boys were supposed to act, at least by decree of fellow millennial boys. You know, this isn't like going to finishing school and learning what the adults want from you. It's okay, this is what my peers expect a boy to be, and then what a man should be, and what that expectation was as presented by the World Wrestling Federation under Vince McMahon, and often starring Vince McMahon, was a man is loud, a man fills the room, a man is charismatic, a man knows what he wants, a man gets what he wants, he's not afraid to use force or to be rude. This was sort of the overall message that was being conveyed, and it was very gratifying on some level to me, because although I was really uncomfortable with all that stuff, at least it was sort of presenting a checklist that I could go through and then kind of be accepted by boys. I had never had a circle of male friends in my entire life until I became a wrestling fan when I was about 13, at which point I started hanging out with this group of boys to watch wrestling either on Monday nights or Thursday nights or Sunday nights for a pay-per-view. And that's a really powerful memory for me. And Vince himself was such an avatar of masculinity, of hyper macho sadism in his character of Mr. McMahon. You know, I end, not a spoiler alert, the core narrative of this book pardon me, because I couldn't fit his whole life into the word count that I was very strictly tied to. The core narrative ends in 1999, specifically at one moment that will forever be etched into my memory, which was Mr. McMahon, Vince's character, throwing back a hood under which he had been concealed to reveal that he had been the mastermind behind all these plot developments that had happened in the wrestling show for the previous few months. He was the greater power. This was the name that they'd given to him. And I remember seeing that grinning face, that, you know, caca eating grin, just gazing into the camera at me. And it's just it was such a powerfully aggressive and totalitarian vibe in that moment. There was this sense of inevitability You know, there's that line from Marvel, Thanos saying, "I am inevitable." Vince was doing that way before Marvel or Thanos were doing it. He was really presenting himself as the inevitable conclusion of masculinity, of America, of capitalism, and there was nothing you could do about it. And that was both terrifying for me and, of course, very attractive, because who doesn't want to feel that liberated and feel that little regard for what other people think of them? So, very long story short, I watched wrestling only for about 2.5 years or so. But they were 2.5 very intense years of focus on it. I learned the language, I learned the general gist of how it worked. It was like I lived in a country for 2.5 years, foreign country. You don't become a native, you don't become the world's greatest expert on it, but you can accumulate a lot in 2.5 years and learn a lot about a terrain and a strange environment. And that's what wrestling is. Wrestling is different from, it has its parallels, and there are elements of wrestling that can be seen in any number of other endeavors, but it's a unique, weird beast. And although I didn't watch wrestling then for about 20 years after I stopped watching in 2001, once the idea came to me in this conversation that my spouse and I were having, she's a journalist and editor as well, we were talking and trying to brainstorm what I could do for the next book after Stan Lee. And one of us mentioned Vince McMahon. Neither one of us can remember who brought him up. But as soon as he was brought up, I just instantly was like, oh, I think that's it. Because no one had really done a serious biography of him. And I knew from when I was a teenager what a powerful artist he was. Maybe an artist of depraved art that is, has all kinds of moral stains on it, but it was tremendous art. And also, as life had gotten more and more like pro wrestling and politics had gotten more like pro wrestling, I found my mind getting casted back to the notion of kayfabe and works and shoots and faces and heels. So when the idea came up in that conversation in early 2020, it was like, seems like a slam dunk. And I've been very lucky that it worked out. And it was a weird return because I hadn't revisited that stuff since that formative period when, I should say, the backstory of the quote you read about cis and trans was I was getting bullied mercilessly, often by the same boys who then later I befriended by watching wrestling. And I do think that there was an element of me being drawn to this as I was kind of letting go of my own masculinity. I ended up coming out as trans the week that I finished the first draft of this book. And I think those things were sort of intertwined, but I've talked enough. You go ahead.
It's
Ask
wonderful.
a question.
Absolutely wonderful. Towards the end of the book, you have this quote. Now, we were talking about it the other day, I think, just for a minute. It is my favorite quote of the book. And I'd like for you, I'm going to read the quote, maybe talk about what you meant when you said this. And I think this would get to the heart of the book. You said towards the end of the book, we have lived for a quarter of a century in the world Mr. McMahon made. That's a very powerful, simple sentence, but it just says a lot about.
Thank you.
No.
I mean that, I do think there were a certain set of revolutions and innovations that Vince McMahon either came up with or at least revolutionized and made very successful, that have spread out into the broader culture and especially into American politics. The most obvious thread there is the Donald Trump connection that, he and Vince and Donald Trump are very close and have been for a number of decades. But I don't want to discount that. That is the most obvious direct line, that you have this very close relationship. Trump has been watching wrestling since he was watching Vince's father's programming in the 50s. But that's not the only influence that Vince has had. I think it's hard to quantify. I'm not a sociologist and I'm not a pollster, so I don't want to overstate my case. But I do think that if you look at the raw numbers of how many people under the age of 18, especially under the age of 30, were watching Attitude Era World Wrestling Federation from like 1996-ish to like 2001, 2002. It's this astounding, not majority, but like huge chunk of America, and especially American young boys, or at least people who thought they were boys. And you can't discount the degree to which we were shaped by a certain set of things that were in that programming. One thing was the very obvious sort of open bigotry and racism and misogyny and all of that. That was something that I'm sure had a lot of impact on a lot of people, no matter whether it was being presented as a joke or as just a show. A lot of people took that pretty credulously. But there's also a broader cynicism. This is sort of what alarms me the most. I mentioned the term kayfabe earlier, Kayfabe, and kayfabe is this very old term that dates back to the carnies, but it has evolved a lot. It used to just mean sort of the fiction of pro wrestling, the big lie, which is everything that you're seeing in the show tonight is real. Not just the competition, although that is real, but also the people. They really are their characters, and this really is a legitimate sport, all that. There was sort of a big lie that kayfabe, the fiction that you maintained, would support. And then kayfabe died in 1989. It had been dying a slow death, and then through some deregulation machinations of the McMahons, kayfabe ended up getting pretty conclusively debunked as what in its form from then. But it didn't die. I should say it died in the way the dinosaurs died. It evolved into a bird. It learned how to soar, because what happened ended up being the development of what I perhaps foolishly decided to coin a term for in this book, which is neo-kayfabe. And neo-kayfabe is not, oh, let's believe in fairies, which is what the old kayfabe used to be. Like, let's just believe that all of this is real and give ourselves over to it. Now, the presentation is not, oh, everything you see here tonight is real. It's everything you see here tonight is fake. The baseline assumption ever since 89, and then especially the mid-90s, has been what you are seeing in this wrestling show is fake, and therefore it's safe, and therefore you don't have to worry about it. But also, what if we told you some truth tonight? Wouldn't that be wild? What if something unplanned happened tonight? Wouldn't that be wild? And what you start to get is this kind of proto-QAnon, Russiagate online conspiracy theorizing in the wrestling forums of the late 90s, which is they're all going, okay, I know it's all fake, much in the way that a QAnoner would say, I know most politics is bullshit, but I'm pretty sure, this is the conspiracy theorist in wrestling, you might say, I'm pretty sure that those two guys who fought each other last night, they actually do hate each other. And I think one of them deliberately injured the other. And then you'll have a huge fight about this entirely hypothetical scenario where you're trying to parse out, okay, I know most of it is nonsense, but I think I saw something real in there. And WWF / eventually WWE really encouraged that speculation and that wild theorizing. They want you to be looking for something buried beneath the surface, and so they bury things beneath the surface. That's the brilliance of neo-kayfabe. It's not just leaving people with ambiguity. It's you start seeding actual truths. You start saying things that you don't think that you, the audience member, or that an audience member rather, doesn't think are allowed to be said. This was the big innovation in the Attitude Era, was all of a sudden you had people saying outrageous things, but also saying backstage secrets, which was an even more important development. Because what you see now is a whole political culture, I think especially among young people, that approaches politics with a 100% assumption that everyone's lying to you and that democracy doesn't work. That's new. I think there's a level of fundamental disillusionment, especially among young people. And I say young broadly, I mean like, under 50 or so, that is not exclusively due to wrestling by any means. But I do think the massive popularity of wrestling must have had downstream effects where you're starting to now see affect other things in, the various kinds of online sleuthing that happen, whether it's political or trying to find, a criminal or whatever. You have this thing that really started to emerge in wrestling forums that now is kind of the paranoid style of the entire internet and country. And I could keep going, but I really think if you look at Vince's story, you start seeing such clear parallels to the way all of us act now that you can't help but believe there was an impact there. I could get into more detail, but you could also read the book.
Right. Please read the book, because this really is so central to what I find so exciting about this book, this kayfabe.
Kayfabe. It rhymes with hey
Kayfabe.
babe.
I know. I practiced it all day, and I knew I was going to get it wrong
It's
the time I
fine.
tried to
Don't
say
worry
it.
about it. It's a made up word.
Yeah, there's this great quote you have on page 6 of the book about this that I love. This is the story about evil and its uses, and what you can get away with when you sledgehammer down the walls between fact and fiction. I think that's really incredible to think about what you just said about the way kids process politics, that fact and fiction is gone now, and we are really living in this very
No, I mean that's the
world.
other element of the neo-kayfabe thing, is that the sort of fact and fiction is not what the valence is. It's not right or wrong or true or false. What the opposition forces are exciting and boring.
Right.
That's it.
Right.
Yeah. And one of the things that Vince was able to get away with by sledgehammering down the walls between fact and fiction was putting his product into a place where even if you hated certain aspects of it, as long as you were watching it, it didn't matter. Right. You were watching addictively, even if you were just hate watching. Or at least there were wrestlers that maybe you hated. And more importantly, you probably hated Vince, because Vince was 9 times out of 10 being portrayed as the ultimate supervillain of that company by playing a slightly parodic version of what he was actually like and what his father was like. But that's sort of a separate question. Yeah. And when you do sledgehammer down those walls, you can have people watching and going, I hate Vince McMahon. He's ruining this company, and he's a jerk. And I think he meant what he said last night and was really insulting. And that's why I'm such a big fan of Stone Cold Steve Austin, because he sticks it to Vince McMahon. And that's why I bought the Stone Cold Steve Austin t-shirt. And it's like, well, who's making the money off of the Stone Cold Steve Austin t-shirt? And who's making the advertising money off of the ratings that you're providing by watching it? It's a genius little loop where, as long as you're excited, even if you're repulsed or think it's not true, as long as you're watching, that's all that matters to Vince.
Yeah. It's a fascinating story, and I think it's a very compelling thesis. Can we talk about Vince just for a little bit? Maybe back up a little?
Please, whatever you want to talk about.
Vince McMahon was not Vince McMahon until he was almost a teenager, 12 years old. He meets his father. He's Vince Lupton. Is that the way you pronounce
Vinny
that?
Lupton. He went by Vinny Lupton. Lupton. It was an English last name. I did way too much genealogical research, I should say. Most of it did not end up in this. There's going to be in the paperback edition, I'm including an appendix of genealogical notes. But Vinny Lupton was the name he went by because his mother remarried when Vince was about 3, when Vinny was 3. And he was raised by a stepfather. Now, what happened to Vince's father? Well, Vincent James McMahon, known these days as Vince Sr., so we'll just call him that, Vince Sr., when he was in his 20s, while his father was a successful boxing and wrestling promoter, Vince Sr. served in World War II, but he didn't go abroad. He just served up and down the East Coast, including in North Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina, where it appears that he met a young woman named Victoria Pataka. That was not her birth name because she was married to someone else. She had been born Victoria Hanner, and then grew up in North Carolina, married a serviceman before we even entered the war in 1941. And then while he was off in his deployment, she seems to have met Vince Sr., and she got pregnant with Vince's older brother, Rod. Then they had Vince, and he was named Vincent Kennedy McMahon, Kennedy being Victoria's mother's last name. But the name didn't stick around too long because neither did Vince's father. Vince Sr. ran off back to New York and sort of, well, and then DC, where he was working for his father's company, and really took it to another level. And he just abandoned, as far as anyone can tell, he seems to have just abandoned Victoria and the two boys. So a few years after that, Vince, with Vince Sr. out of the picture, Victoria ends up marrying this guy, Leo Lupton Jr., Leo Hubert Lupton Jr. And Vince is raised as Vinnie Lupton in this larger clan of Luptons because Leo had a previous marriage with some kids too. So Vince did not have a great time with Leo Lupton, and he didn't even know his birth father. He didn't meet him until he was 12. The first years of Vince's consciousness and his memories, he was with Leo and his mother, who he spoke very ill of later in his life. Vince said that his mother, or heavily implied that his mother sexually abused him, and was very explicit in saying that Leo had beaten him, had physically abused him. And it was, whatever the truth of that is, it's hard for me to determine. I wasn't there, but I did hear some corroborating evidence about Leo being a scary individual for children. It seems to have been a harrowing time for Vince, and I don't think he was a very happy child. There is actually very little evidence of him being a misanthrope, but it seems like he mostly kept to himself and was kind of quiet, was a little withdrawn. And then something miraculous happens, which is he meets his birth father, because Vincent Sr. had gone off and married again. We had a woman named Juanita, and Juanita then berated Vince Sr. into meeting his children. He was like, she said, you have to have some kind of relationship with your boys. And side note, Vince Sr. had by that time sort of adopted another family related to his second wife. So Vince gets shunted into this strange world where all of a sudden he, who's grown up in poverty in North Carolina, I mean, Leo Lupton was an electrician. All of a sudden he's hanging out with his birth father, who has this other family that he's been doting on and loving and providing with material aid. And his father's rich, and they meet in New York City. And I can't imagine what he thought New York City was like at age 12 after having lived in places in North Carolina with nicknames like Splinterville. And that, I think, is the fundamental relationship that I'm trying to analyze in this book, is the father-son dynamic that Vince experienced with his birth father. Vince will always tell you in public interviews that he loved his father and that he thinks his father was great, but his stories about his father will always be, yeah, my father yelled at me, or yeah, I was, because eventually he went into business with his father. I'm skipping over a lot of stuff, but when he went into business with his father, it's the beginning of a lot of stories of, my dad told me I was a screw up, my dad told me I blew this deal, my dad was mad at me. Never a warm story. The closest thing to a warm story is he says his father had never told him I love you, except for on his deathbed in their final interaction. He went to say goodbye to his dad, and as he was walking out of the room, according to Vince, his father yelled, I love you, Vinny. And that was the only time. I can't imagine how difficult and traumatic it must be to have that kind of a challenging relationship with a parent. I'm very lucky that I don't have something like that with my father. And I think when you look at Mr. McMahon, the character that Vince was playing in the Attitude Era WWF, I think it's more his father than him in a lot of ways. I think what elements there are that resemble Vince, the real Vince, are really elements that were imported from his father. Because the people I found who knew Vince before he met his father, the kids, they all said Vince was this nice kid. He wasn't a showboat. He wasn't violent or anything. And then once he meets his father, he becomes obsessed with wrestling. And all of the other accounts from then on are just, he was monomaniacally focused on wrestling. And as time goes on, the stories become, and he was a jerk, and the jerky ways in which he acts are very tied to the ways he saw his birth father act once he was actually in touch with him and working with him.
It's horribly tragic on one level.
Sure.
Yeah. The story of young Vinny has, for most practical purposes, been eradicated from the WWF.
Yeah, they don't talk about it.
You just don't talk about it. He begins with his father, right, as character. That is intriguing and gets a lot to the psychology of this guy. Going to the wrestling world itself, one of the things when I think about wrestling, I always think about is the music.
Oh, yeah.
You do an amazing job here of telling that story of MTV and Cyndi Lauper and how important that whole arc of the early story was in creating Vince McMahon. What should people know about that so they want to read the book?
The thing I always say is what took WWF over the top and made it an actual cultural byword was not the WWF's product alone. It was MTV and WWF working together. There was a very lucrative partnership that they had where they sort of shared talent, where wrestlers appeared on MTV. This is like 1984, 85. It's pretty early in MTV's existence. And wrestling, WWF Wrestling, ended up being their most successful show. Whenever they would have a special, it would beat their previous records for how many people had watched anything on MTV. But that MTV boost was so critical. And it wasn't just the talent sharing, it was the music. There was this overall name that they gave to this period, and they were using it at the time, which was the Rock and Wrestling Connection. And it's so hard to understand why all of these why the World Wrestling Federation and its programming became so popular if you don't know the music. Because all of these shows, once they started really rolling with the WWF and MTV aesthetic, had, Hulk Hogan coming out while Eye of the Tiger plays by Survivor. Now, that was something he'd been using because he'd been using that even before he was at the WWF, but that wasn't that long previous. It was like 83 that he started using it because he was in Rocky 3. He had a small part in Rocky 3, and that featured that song. But like you watch wrestling from that period now on the official legal streams, and they've edited out all the pop songs. So Hulk Hogan doesn't come out to Eye of the Tiger. He comes out to the vastly inferior song Real American by Rick Derringer, which is what he adopted as his licensed, like, official theme music a few years later. But that's later. You're ruining history by editing that out. And, the Junkyard Dog would come out to Another One Bites the Dust. And Ricky the Dragon Steamboat would come out to, the Alan Parsons Project. And the music, when you watch old pirated versions of these, live recordings that people committed to tape or have reconstructed from various sources, it's a totally different experience because it's not the cheesy music that gets piped in for the now Bowdlerized official versions. You hear, not only are these songs great, you have to remember they were new. A lot of these songs were very new at the time. And hearing a hit pop song accompany, it would be like some major wrestler coming out to, I don't know, Anti-Hero by Taylor Swift or something right now. And I didn't even mention Cyndi Lauper. Sorry, Cyndi Lauper, as you mentioned, was the initial instigator of this rock and wrestling connection through a very weird roundabout way, where wrestler Captain Lou Albano was on a flight to Puerto Rico. I can't remember whether it was a flight to or from Puerto Rico, but both Lauper and Albano were on the same flight. And this was a good ways before the connection happened, the rock and wrestling connection happened. The initial contact was just them exchanging phone numbers because they got along so well. And then when they were doing a music video for Girls Just Want to Have Fun, her boyfriend / manager, David Wolf, was like, we need to have a dad to play, we need to have somebody to play your dad in this video. Who are we going to get? Maybe we should get Captain Lou Albano, who had, was a somewhat known cultural figure. And Cyndi allegedly goes, I know Captain Lou. She had his phone number. So she just calls him up and he appears in the video. And the video is a huge hit. And this is the early rumblings of neo-kayfabe, in that it's not in any way a fully formed concept, but you start to see how the real world and the wrestling world are starting to blur, because Vince goes, oh, everyone likes this video and it's got my wrestler in it. Why don't we capitalize on that? And they end up having Lauper come on the show and have Albano do this very intense, even now to watch, sexist, misogynist angle where he's like saying, oh, Cyndi Lauper only has become a star because I was in her video, and no woman has ever succeeded without a man, and women aren't interesting, and all that stuff. And it really worked people up. They really messed with reality. They eventually they, made up. There was like a whole storyline where he had a brain problem that made him evil, but the story continued and it was on MTV, and it was massively important, that musical connection, the fact that actually relevant pop and rock music was being used in this hip, weird, slightly campy product of pro wrestling. It was a big hook, and I really think it's a shame that the official versions have excised those sounds.
Yeah. Let's talk about another dark subject if we can. The misogyny, the homophobia,
Sure.
the racial stereotyping, the ethnic stereotyping. I remember walking through the room when one of my kids was watching wrestling sometime in the 2000s and saying, oh my God, I have to turn this off. This is horrible.
Yeah.
How has that breaking down the wall between reality and fiction shaped a whole series, a couple of generations now of people?
Yeah. Well, there's the it adds the level of ironic disavowal. Once you say, hey, I know this all sounds terrible, but don't worry, I know it's fake. I know it's fake, and everybody knows it's fake, so it doesn't count. Well, the trouble is, just because something is intended in jest doesn't exactly make it fake per se. Because you can start something as a joke and end up being deadly serious with it, or at least having deadly serious impact. That's the thing about wrestling, is even if the fighting is fake or staged, people get injured all the time. It's in the long run for your body, it's a nightmare. It's a really terrible thing physically for your form. But, because it's presented as something that's fake these days, people tend to think, well, how dangerous could it actually be? And I think the racism, the misogyny, the homophobia, the transphobia, all of that is similar, in that even if it was intended as kind of a gag or something campy or a joke, which I think is always a little dubious with things that tend to fit with the political program of Vince McMahon, I think it deadens your responses as a child, especially. It numbs you to those sorts of statements. You get inoculated because you're getting this light, slightly diffused version of the bigotry and the hatred and the awfulness, and you just start to absorb it, and you go, well, it's not real, so who cares?
Yeah.
But then eventually you find that you have an unhealthily high tolerance for people saying those exact words, even when they mean them. And the thing is, even when they mean them, a lot of people have adopted neo-kayfabe in a very smart way, devious way, to push the fascist agenda, where you can just constantly be like, I don't really mean it. You can wink, wink at everything and dog whistle here and dog whistle there. It doesn't, the fact that it's semi-ironic doesn't make it less dangerous, and it doesn't make it something that we can just excuse. But that formula was not exclusively happening with the WWF, but I think the WWF was arguably the most crystallized version of it.
I think this is, again, one of the most important parts of the book, this social construction of bigotry, of transphobia, of homophobia, of gender stereotypes is happening on the television Monday night, Thursday night, Sunday night, and it's just seeping into the house, and it just becomes normal. And kids are being shaped by that.
Yeah.
And we see it every place we look right now.
Yeah. I'm not going to lay all the blame at wrestling's feet. Right. I should say, I don't know if this is, I hope this isn't coming across as me hating on wrestling as an art form. I think as an industry, it's awful. But I think as an art form, wrestling is transcendent. I love professional wrestling. And I don't think the racism and the homophobia and the transphobia are hard-coded into the art form. Like, what gives me a lot of hope for wrestling is all of the independent queer and trans wrestling organizations that have popped up around the country and probably around the world, but I'm only really familiar with the ones here. We have one, I live in Providence, Rhode Island, and we have a local one in Boston, just a short little drive away, called the Boston League of Wicked Wrestlers. So it used to be the Boston League of Women Wrestlers, and they wanted to be more gender diverse, but they didn't want to lose the acronym, which is BLOWW, blow. So they decided to change the W to have it mean wicked. And it's just this great time. They get what makes wrestling work, and it's not in any way hateful. It's still really good, and it's hateful towards things that deserve hate, perhaps, but I don't think that's hard-coded. I think a lot of that is a legacy of the fact that it's an unregulated industry where workers have no say. It's practically unregulated, I should say. Certainly compared to other athletic events, it's the wild, wild west.
You say at the end of the book that Mr. McMahon will one day die. The WWE will one day go away, but wrestling will always be.
The ring never dies. Exactly. I think wrestling is a very deeply embedded part of the human consciousness and human societies. Non-staged wrestling dates back at least as far as, ancient Sumer, the Sumerians with Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh very prominently features wrestling. The Hebrew Bible, I'm Jewish and I do all this Bible study all the time, Torah study. You read it in Hebrew and there it is, Jacob wrestling the angel. Maybe it's God, maybe it's a man, who knows, but he wrestles. We don't know who he's wrestling, but the Bible is very clear that he's wrestling.
Right.
And so unstaged wrestling is very old and very universal. And staged wrestling, I think, is just a brilliant innovation. It only really emerged in this crystallized form about 100 odd years ago. Little more than 100 now that I'm thinking about it. I'm bad at math. But I think it's going to last. I think when you see these low budget independent promotions that put on shows, all you can think is, oh, if the electrical grid fails, you can still set up a ring and have people come watch a wrestling show. Like, most entertainment gets a lot more difficult these days if you don't have electronics. Even my chosen profession, books, we all love books, but a lot of people just are allergic to books now and only consume them through audiobooks or through YouTube summaries. And if that goes, my profession will get a lot more difficult if the grid goes down and society collapses. But I think wrestling will do just fine. I think traveling wrestling troops will be or stationary ones will be a staple for a long time.
You mentioned the deregulation. I'm really fascinated with that arc that goes from Vince trying to get deregulation of the industry in Connecticut, New Jersey, and he hires the young Rick Santorum to be his lawyer.
Young Rick Santorum, just fresh out of law school, practically.
Yeah.
Crazy. Just by sheer coincidence, he happened to be working at the law firm that was working on deregulation of wrestling in Pennsylvania. I'm sorry, keep going.
I'm fascinated with that. So Vince is supporting that. He gets involved in politics, sees the power, and by the time we get to 2016, Linda is in the Trump administration.
Yeah, Linda was the inaugural director of Small Business Administration, which is a cabinet position for Trump.
What is their, how do they get involved? How do they move?
Yeah, they had a little bit of a preview of being in politics in the early 80s when they owned the Cape Cod Coliseum in South Yarmouth, Massachusetts, which had a bunch of issues with the local town council. They call them selectmen there. And they executed this intimidation campaign against the selectmen. They invited more than 100 people to flood the one selectmen's meeting where they were going to be discussing the regulations that the McMahons were fighting. And sure enough, the selectmen decided, we'll keep our hands off this one. And that was a little taste, but what really started to kick them into Republican politics was their effort to deregulate wrestling in the 80s. They wanted to not be regulated as a sport, which was how wrestling had historically been regulated. They wanted to be regulated the same way as, this is the comparison they always said, the circus or the Harlem Globetrotters. Those were the comparison points they always made when they were in lawsuits or in legislative hearings. They would say, we're like the circus or Harlem Globetrotters. We do athletics, but it's safe because it's fake. Now, they were only saying this privately, not privately, but, in these lawsuits where they were trying to get out of liability for things or in their efforts to deregulate, but they were not publicizing or telling the broader audience that this was fake. That was not their intention yet. In fact, I don't know that was ever their intention. I think they tried to play, they would have been perfectly happy, the McMahons, playing the two-tiered game they were doing, which was you tell the legislators and the lawyers that it's fake, and you tell the audience that it's real. That may well have been fine for them if they had had their druthers. But the trouble was, eventually, the New York Times found out about the effort in New Jersey to deregulate and reported on it. And when you have an A1 story in the New York Times saying, I believe the headline was, now it can be told these wrestlers are just having fun, that's a real death sentence to old kayfabe. And that said, it didn't stop their climb into deregulation. They kept pushing for it. They were like, well, this wasn't our intention, but they rolled with it, and they kept pushing to have fewer taxes applied to them and fewer safety regulations applied to them. And that really put them into close contact with politicians. They were doing direct lobbying with, Rick Santorum was one of the people working on that effort. I've spoken to people in New Jersey and Connecticut, all over the place, who were getting wined and dined by the McMahons, and they made some close contacts in politics. And for a while, they were donating to both Democrats and Republicans, depending on who could help them. But somewhere around the mid-2000s, the mid-aughts, they shifted towards a pretty hardline Republican donor structure. And now, Linda in the 2020 campaign ran the biggest pro-Trump super PAC. They became very good at raising money and giving money for Republican candidates. And now they're, at least Linda, Vince these days is an ambiguous figure, but Linda is still a major player in Republican politics.
That was going to be my next question, if she was still a player.
Yeah, as far as I can tell. We'll see what happens with this election cycle. I'll fully admit that I haven't been paying super close attention to the McMahons in the past few weeks or months because I've been working on my next book. Yeah. But Linda Linda may have some of her name tarnished slightly by Vince, but she herself has been nothing but a joy for the Republicans.
Mhm.
She has raised a lot of money and given a lot of money, and she doesn't do anything scandalous.
Right.
So I have no reason to believe that she's been shunted out to the woods. I don't think it's anything like that.
The deregulation, all those moves to deregulate safety, is there a direct line between that and the death of Bret
Of
Hart's
Owen, sorry, the death of what'd you say? Of Owen Hart?
Bret Hart's brother?
Yes, Owen Hart. Yes.
Hart, sorry.
I don't know about a direct line. The most direct line is even before the deregulation effort, unions have just never been a thing in wrestling. Promoters of professional wrestling have done a very good job of crushing any incipient effort at unionizing, Vince McMahon included. So there's no employee safety, there's no force within the employees that can try and push for greater safety. But yeah, the deregulation, it's not like you can necessarily say exactly A leads to B, but certainly there's a much greater likelihood that a health or safety official, if it had not been deregulated by 1999, and largely sort of looked on as a fake safe thing, you probably wouldn't have had such a slapdash job being done on the harness that Owen Hart was in, where he was supposed to slide in from the rafters on a wire, basically. And it was a faulty setup. It was a new technician who Owen hadn't really worked before, and he fell to his death. He fell more than 70 feet and was pronounced dead by the time he got to the hospital. And I think, let me put it this way. I don't know about the deregulation being the thing that led to it, but certainly if there were regulation and there were health and safety standards, then it would be harder to have had something like that happen. But I'm just saying that even before the deregulation, health and safety standards weren't great. There was like a gesture made towards them, but it was not really a safe industry ever.
Yeah.
Should we turn to questions? I don't know what time. Since we started late, I don't know what the timing is. But
yeah, I don't either. Aaron, do we want to take some questions?
It might be good to go to some questions now.
Yeah.
Yeah, y'all can take some questions. We've got extended for about 10 more minutes.
Okay. Mark Christ wants to know what your next book will be.
Yeah, I was just saying it's going to be a book called Hollywood Freaks. It's a biography of the musician Beck, but it's not just about him. It's using his life and career, especially in the 90s, as a lens for understanding how countercultures work and why they succeed or don't succeed and what success looks like. There's a lot of other stuff crammed in there, but I have to sort of sit on all of the exciting details about that.
If you have a question, put it in the chat box over here, and we'll.
I think the chat box is a good place for it. Yeah.
You are working through something. It appears to me because you are focused on the 90s. Is this
a little bit? I mean, the thing is, I say not exactly joking that my first 3 books are about the 3 things I was obsessed with as of my 14th birthday: Marvel Comics, the World Wrestling Federation, and the musician Beck. These were the things that I was fixated on. And I think it's not a coincidence. I'm working through things that I have a deep familiarity with and affection, even if it's a very complicated affection for. I think for the first 3 books, it's not so much that it's like comfort. It's more just that's where my head often is. And let me put it this way. We're all living in the past in a lot of ways. We're in a very nostalgic period in our, history as a species. So if I'm going to spend a lot of time in the past, I'm going to walk around and do some investigation and ask some questions in the past. I figure I'm so fixated on the culture of my youth. Why not interrogate the culture of my youth and try and figure out, okay, well, what was actually happening when these works were being made that had such an influence on me? And what was I missing? What was I picking up on that I didn't even know I was picking up on? And then what do people not understand about how important that was? You know, I think often of a line from Jonathan Letham's The Fortress of Solitude, where the protagonist's girlfriend is asking him, why are you so obsessed with your childhood? And he pauses and he says, it's the only thing not overshadowed by my childhood. And I I think about that a lot. These are towering times in our lives when we're in our teenage years. And there's nothing wrong with being fixated on that stuff as long as you're being fixated critically, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
No, I don't see anything else. Let me do a quick commercial again. Y'all get this book. We've only tapped into just a little bit of this. It is so exciting. Let's see. Someone says,
what wrestler I admire.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Sami Stein, the Hebrew champion of the 1930s, back when you had when people were, a little more ballsy about depicting Jewishness as an ethnicity in wrestling. Now you kind of jump around it. I have a whole thesis in my head about why that's an ethnic stereotype that hasn't really flown recently. But I love that there was a period where you could have Sami Stein, you could have Paul Bosch, who was not Jewish, but wrestled as a Jewish character, and then was allegedly found out because a sports writer was doing an interview with him in the locker room, and he walked out of the shower and noticed that there was no circumcision. So I don't like talking about admiring wrestlers of recent vintage. I don't want to play favorites, but there are a lot of wrestlers from the past that deserve more attention than they get. Wrestling forgets its history very easily,
I grew up in watching wrestling in the territorial days before
Vince
destroyed that. And we got where I lived, we got wrestling out of Dallas and Memphis. But every once in a while, like once every 3 or 4 months, there'd be an Andre the Giant match that we'd get to see. He was like a god to us when we were kids.
I'm telling you, he was a national monument. He was a walking national monument. You just came to pay your respects.
And when you tell the story about Andre in this book, it is heartbreaking what happens to him, to me at least, because I remember him as this great big figure, and Vince just kind of uses him.
Yeah, he sort of used Andre up. Andre's last big achievement was Vince had him wrestle Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 3 in 1987, and he had Andre lose to Hogan. And Andre basically didn't lose ever. There were like a few random exceptions, but his undefeatability was a big part of the mystique. And he had Hulk beat him. And not only that, the whole run up to it had been a nightmare because Andre was in terrible health as of then and really shouldn't have been wrestling, and certainly shouldn't have been wrestling drunk, which he was. But Vince really sort of used him up and wore him out. And then in the years after that, his declining years, it was kind of sad to watch him on the wrestling show. He was depicted as an evil character, which was something he really didn't like. He had always liked being a positive inspiration for kids and everything. And Vince was making him play a bad guy. He was in very bad health. He looked terrible. And then in 1993, he died. And, one of the great honors of my life, I really mean this, was tracking down the funeral director who cremated Andre, which was a totally random coincidence. That funeral director grew up being best friends with Vinny's stepbrother, Richard. And he was in Vince's house as a child, this funeral director. But I really think Andre was a remarkable individual, and getting to record for the first time what his sort of sending off into another state was something that I didn't take lightly.
That part of the book, I'm glad to know that was sort of all just accidental that you found this person, because that part of the book is very deep. It really contextualizes. You feel the dirt of that story. You really do.
Thank you.
I really love that. We've got 5 minutes, but we've got a question here about how did wrestling inform ideas about femininity?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I talk about this a bit in the Polygon essay that you were mentioning. But I I think the big lesson in transness that I got from wrestling was watching it for the research of this book. I started to notice just how queer it was, and not just in the way that like playground taunts will say, oh, wrestling's gay because it's men touching each other, although that is important. The bigger thing is it's men, male-bodied individuals, showing great pain and vulnerability. Because that, maybe we can end it here, but that's sort of the essence of wrestling for me. And I mean that in a very literal sense. You can have a wrestling match between two people who have no physical ability, no strength, as long as you have one of them, poke the other one, as long as the other one can go, oh, I got poked. Oh no, I'm so hurt. I'm in such agony because I got poked. And showing this mask of what you don't show to the rest of the people of the world, that's a really special thing, that kind of vulnerability. And I think that was a big inspiration in me starting to get towards transitioning, was going, okay, what would my secret face be if I were bold enough to show it in the way that these wrestlers do? Other than that, I don't think I get a lot of great messages about femininity from, or at least I certainly didn't get good messages about femininity back in the day. There weren't, I mean, China was a wonderful performer, Joni Laurer, who was a tremendous wrestler, but she was very mistreated by the show. I mean, you really did not get to see her in full flower as what she was. You just sort of saw her kind of exploited and pushed into boxes. So these days it's a little better. It's in fact a lot better, but it's not nearly as far as it needs to be.
Well, I do think that's also a good place to stop. I could talk about this book for hours, and I plan to tomorrow at the office if you're here. I really cannot tell you how highly I respect this book, and I'm really excited that I got invited to do this. So thank you so much for coming and doing this with us. And thank you.
I'm really honored. Thank you. You had great questions, and thanks to everybody who showed up and was patient. Yeah, twice. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Well,
thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
See you around.